So welcome everyone to the Rory's Fire Programme Funder Forum. Thank you for getting up early or staying up late or joining us via the recording. I'm Tom Stafford. I lead the Fire project, and I'm just going to introduce Rory and Fire before we go into our speakers. Please do say who you are and where you come from in the chat, so we can get a sense of who's joining us today. We are going to record the talk, but then we're going to stop the recording for the discussion, which we're going to carry under the Chatham House rule, which is that you can report what's said, but not who said it. And I am just going to give you some information which is on slides, which I think Amanda is going to share the link in the chat now. Slides. There we go. So the Research and Research Institute, a consortium of 18 core funder partners shown there on the right, 10 co-designed projects on everything from Agora, which is about national research systems, to the Atlas of peer review. And part of that portfolio of projects is Fire, the accelerator for funding in accelerator for experiments in research funding and innovation funding. And what we exist to do with our wonderful funder partners is create awareness and excitement for doing experiments, for raising the standard of evidence in research funding, to build capacity, to encourage the pickup of experiments and a culture of experimentation through the research funding system. And this is the kind of the model is that we have a kind of ramp. We're here at the forum. We work with funders to build capacity in kind of bespoke support, and then we hope to launch up the ramp into actual experiments which generate new evidence on the research funding system. So you're here at the Funders Forum. We've had 3 already. They've been fantastic. Please do catch up on the recordings, which are available on the Rory YouTube channel. And we can maybe share a link in the chat there. Thank you, Amanda. And we have more talks coming up in the spring, and one more to be announced before our summer break. So please do register for the talks and to ensure you receive invites. And that the plan is that along with the talks, along with our kind of focused sprints, which are kind of intensive workshops on planning and building capacity for experiments. The first, due to be announced soon, will be on use of AI in reviewer selection. We're heading towards the Meta Science 2025 conference in London, where we are excited to see many of you there, to hear reports from existing Fire experiments and report on the new phase 2 experiments for a Fire. So if you'd like to do experiments, we have some sort of chef recommendations, you know, the things that we think are most impactful and most easy for funders to pick up. And one of them is partial randomization, the topic for today's talk. We're very grateful for Ken Emmon to join us from the British Academy, and Adrian Barnett to join us from Queensland University of Technology. And without further ado, I will pass over to Ken and Adrian. I think, Ken, you're going first. Do I need to stop sharing and then you can take over?
Yeah, there we are. Is that working all right? Can you see?
That looks great. You
okay.
take it away.
Well, great. Thanks very much, Tom. It's great to have the chance to talk a little bit about our partial randomization experiment being run at the British Academy on our small grants programme, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. The British Academy is the UK's national academy for what we call the SHAPE disciplines, social sciences, humanities and the arts for people in the economy. And we have been engaged in, is it going to go on? There we are. Yeah, funding research grants over a very long period of time. It's a scheme that attracted always a lot of attention, a lot of interest, and increasingly our assessors were finding it very difficult to make the final judgments, the fine-grained decisions that were taken when you're supporting across a whole range of over 20 subject areas. And also the motivation for considering the randomisation partly came from the work of our diversity working group as well, to try and increase the range of people who might apply to this particular scheme. The small grants offered by the British Academy are very small scale in value, up to £10,000 GBP, and they're awards that can run over up to 24 months. For this scheme, we're able to draw on funding from both the UK government, from the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, but also from additional funding that we are able to attract from partner funders like the Leverhulme Trust, whose very generous contribution to the scheme is reflected in the titling of the awards as British Academy Leverhulme Small Research Grants, but also from the Wellcome Trust and from a range of other partner funders and endowed funds that the Academy holds. We're talking about very small sums of money. People commonly use this for either a pilot study, they're going on to test a proof of concept with this small scale funding, or indeed many of the people who are successful are early career researchers who are looking to use this as a first grant opportunity to get their name as a principal investigator. The awards, the applicants have to be UK based as the principal applicant, but many of them have international partners, and it's a very flexible award as well, which allows for people to be able to do travel, field work, work with partners, employ a research assistant for a small, relatively small amount of time, to be able to hold a workshop. There's a whole variety of possibilities that are these awards can be used for. And as at the end of January, we had around 900 awards in progress, based at about 112 different institutions, and the awards are also open to independent researchers. And we offer the call twice a year. The next call is about to open in April. When the applications are submitted to us, we do an internal eligibility check, make sure that people do actually meet the criteria for eligibility, which are fairly flexible, but it is the key thing is being the UK base that they need to have. And then the applications will be assigned to a relevant subject specialists across the 21 different subject areas that the Academy represents. Usually the assessors are fellows of the British Academy, but they can also use past award holders where necessary. And applicants are now judged against standard eligibility criteria that are set out in the application form, the guidance that we give. And the assessor is simply asked to say whether the strength of the proposal is good enough for funding based on the standard criteria, the quality and interest of the proposal, the ability of the applicant to make it a success of it, do they have the track record to make a success of it, the feasibility of the methodology and timescale, and the appropriateness of the costs that are requested. And if all the answers given by the assessors that the application is strong enough for funding on that basis, and they pass the threshold, therefore, they're then entered into the randomisation. And the way that the randomisation works, applications having been assessed through that normal peer review to start with, so a human assessor deciding whether or not it qualifies, all the applications that pass the threshold are then entered into the randomised allocation. We don't make any distinction once they pass the threshold. And we've been delighted that this approach has allowed us to give a bit more feedback to applicants, because we can tell them specifically whether or not they passed the threshold, i.e. if they get all answers, all yes, pass the threshold, and are simply not randomly selected to get the funding, we can tell them that that was the case. If they fail on any of the particular criteria, we can tell them on the grounds on which they've not been as strong as other applicants or as expected for this. We're going to hear more from Adrian very shortly about the effects of the changes that we've made on the diversity, which, as I say, was one of the key drivers for us originally. It was our diversity working group that recommended this. But as you can see, the numbers of applications that have been submitted, these are the 5 rounds that have been run so far since we introduced the randomisation. That's 2 rounds a year. And you can see that the numbers have been going up every time. But surprisingly or interestingly, the numbers or percentage passing the threshold has remained fairly stable at around 60 or just over 60%. And we're very proud of the fact we can make hundreds of awards because of all these partners, funders that we're able to bring into the scheme. We're able to support quite a lot of the applications that are submitted. It's nil at the moment for the 24-25 programme. That competition is about to be finalised and confirmed by our Research Awards Committee this Friday, so it's very short. One of the things that we have been also considering, but unable at the moment to do the full analysis of, is what effect having moved to randomisation will have on the outcomes of the grants at the end of the process. But just to give you a sense of the baseline from which we're going to be considering that, on average, most applicants will produce at least 3 publications as a result of the award, 3 to 4. Most often these are journal articles or book chapters, but we do have people who produce monographs or other types of publication. They will usually produce or take part in around 6 dissemination activities, presentations at conferences and seminars, revealing results of what the research that we've been able to support to allow them to achieve. And we have very, very good figures on what they subsequently go on to achieve. I mentioned many people use it as a pilot study. If you simply count the non-UK government funding that they go on to win, the return is about 5.4 to 1. If you were to include UK government funding, that is from the research councils or elsewhere, the figure goes up significantly of the amount of funding that they're subsequently able to obtain. So that gives you a little flavour of what is possible, even with very small sums of money. And as you can see with the numbers involved, we have had real difficulty in the amount of time and effort that was required of our assessors to be able to achieve these decisions. And that's where Adrian and his colleagues have come in and have really enormously helped us by undertaking the actual randomisation itself, which I think Adrian is now going to go on and tell you about. So over to you, Adrian.
Thank you, Ken. And thank you, everybody, for being up so early to accommodate me here in Australia. And thanks to Tom and Amanda for the invite. So, oh, let me hide that if I can. I've forgotten how you hide that. Oh, that was bad. Let's just, oh, there we go, done. Lotteries and random choices have actually been used for an incredible amount of time. So there's, and for very important things like football games. So there was a football match between a team from Sheffield and a team from Shrewsbury that was a draw so many times. In the end, they decided just to flip a coin. And I believe there's going to be a statue in Sheffield to commemorate that occurrence. But it's also happened more recently in the African Cup of Nations about 10 years ago. 2 teams finished on the same points, same goal difference, had the same result, had a draw against each other. So there was no way of picking them apart. So they were, they did it on TV and they picked a coloured ball and one team went out. So if we can do it for football, surely we can do it for everything. We do it for much more important things like medical degrees in Sweden and the Netherlands. So lots of bright young kids want to go and study medicine. And unfortunately, there aren't enough places for them all to go on. How on earth do you choose between, you know, kids who have all got excellent grades? The way it's done here, unfortunately, is the kids have to go through extra exams and interviews. I don't think that works. I think it benefits kids who know how to react in the interview, which is often those kids whose dad or mum or neighbour are a doctor. And yeah, I think it starts to create inequities. And I will come back to these medical degrees with one of my last slides as well. Also for bad things, how on earth do you choose who to go to war? Well, I know at least in the USA and Australia, it was done using a birthday lottery. So again, live on telly, the numbers would be picked out, and all men of, I think, age over 20 then were called up. And it's used in Athenian democracy, so over 2,500 years ago. And here it is, the kleroteron. I'm going to pronounce that terribly, probably. But you can see, and this was actually quite big. So it was designed to be done in public. And you can see these little slots. So little clay tablets would go in with the people's names on. The other really interesting thing, as a statistician, you can see it's square. They actually stratified. So each row here contained a sort of cross-section of the population. Now, only rich white male population, but still, within that population, they made sure that just by random choice, they didn't get all members of the same family, say. And then there was a bit at the top where balls would be dropped in, probably by some sort of uncorruptible young innocent, I would imagine. And then black or white balls came out at the bottom, and if you were black, your row got discarded, and if you were white, you were chosen. Or was it the other way around? I can't remember. It's like the thumbs up, thumbs down. Apparently nobody knows if thumbs down actually meant death or life. And yeah, interesting that we don't know, but they've probably got a young boy to do it. And if you know that Coptic popes are actually still to this day chosen at random, and it is a young blindfolded boy who chooses the pope. Okay, why do we use, oh, and sorry, the title of that slide is When the Reasons Run Out. I should have mentioned that because I really like that phrase. This is when you should use a lottery, when you cannot pick between who you've got left. And I'm going to talk a bit now about research and say why it is very hard to pick apart research applications. And that's partly because they are incredibly complex things, tackling all sorts of different diseases. Very hard to know who's going to be the best out of all of that. And here's a nice slide using NIH data. There's the paper there. I'll post a link to my slides so people can read the papers. So what we've got here is the percentile scores for the grants. So these are all grants that were funded. Down this end at 20, you've got the grants that just made it across the line. And up here at 0, you've got the grants that were aced, and everybody agreed that these were wonderful top scoring grants. And what we've got here is a number of publications. Now you can see there probably is a bit of a upward slope here. The number of publications do increase for higher scores, but it's very shallow. And then similar here for citations. Some of the top rated grants do seem to get a few more citations, but it's a pretty weak relationship. So when we pick those grants through peer review, which is an incredibly difficult process, the ones that everybody thinks are going to be blockbusters and the ones that just sneak across the line, really, when you look at them, and I know publications and citations are not perfect outcomes, but on these outcomes, it's very hard actually to tell them apart because research is inherently unpredictable. And then similarly, a study we did here, there is definitely an element of the luck of the draw in the reviewers. You know, you tend to get 3 to 5 sort of reviewers, depending on the size of the scheme, looking at your proposal. So we got some Australian data where we got the reviewers that everybody had, and we essentially lotterized them ourselves. We put them in a bag, redrew them. So then we did that for everybody, so you could see how many applications were always above the line, how many always below the funding line, and how many flitted above or below the line, depending on who turned up to review their application. And who turned up to review their application is pretty random. You know, it depends on who was invited, who was overseas, who used good keywords so we could find them, you know, all these kind of pretty random things. Anyway, the results were, there were a sort of top 9% of grants that were always funded. So sort of every reviewer agreed that these were excellent. Sort of bottom 60% that were never funded, so quite a lot more. Partly that's because the funding line was so high, I think at about 20%. But then I think the interesting group is this almost 30% in the middle that were sometimes funded and sometimes not, just purely based on the luck of the draw of the reviewers. So we do seem to have this big grey zone, and I'm sure this will be repeated in other systems. So the New Zealand Health Research Council, they'd noticed this kind of difficulty, the sorts of difficulties that Ken talked about there with making decisions and how hard it is to pick apart you know, these research projects in all these different areas. So they decided for one of their schemes to use a conditional lottery. So it was a fairly big scheme, really, 150,000 New Zealand dollars, so about £70,000 over 3 years, so not a small scheme. And the reviewers were asked to look at 2 yes/no criteria. So that were that the research is potentially transformative and the proposal is exploratory but viable. So the scheme was called the Explorer Grant Scheme. So it was specifically targeted at sort of slightly more risky research, which I think was another reason why the New Zealand Health Research Council were happy to use a lottery here, because it was even more unpredictable. We're asking people to take a risk here, and we know that those risks sometimes don't come off. And simply you were randomised if most reviewers gave 2 yeses. And we've worked with the New Zealand Health Research Council. Actually, one of the most interesting things we did was just survey applicants to see whether they liked it or not. And it was an acceptable method, really, because 63% in favour and 25% against. We don't have a baseline for other funding schemes, but I don't think there's any funding scheme in the world that has 100% popularity. So 63% might actually prove to be one of the more popular methods. And then I think it was really interesting in the comments, quite a few people said the same thing. Researchers were happy to be randomised as long as the other people in the pool with them were equally as good. So as long as the weak applications were filtered out, and then also some of them did want this sort of the strong applications to be funded. So if they'd done an application that was really good, but yeah, so I think that's really interesting that if they felt like they was in the middle, if they felt like, okay, I'm in the grey zone, I'm happy to be randomised, as long as everybody else in that grey zone is sort of equally good as me. And then the last thing that made me laugh is that there was greater support for randomisation amongst those people that won funding at random. So that kind of shows that researchers maybe sometimes aren't the best judge of a funding system, maybe, I'm sorry to say. But yeah, researchers like the system that funds them. And then last year in Australia, we did a fun little exercise. It wasn't as big as I wanted it to be. I'd love to do it again with more funding. But basically, we did a sort of research priority setting exercise. You might have heard of the James Lind Alliance. They do this really well, I think. And our question was, what questions about research funding would you like to have answered by research? So, very, very meta research, very on brand with Rory. And what really surprised me was that both the top 2 questions were about lottery. So would a lottery be fairer? Oh, the thing's in the way here, sorry. Would lottery be fairer and more efficient without reducing quality? And then a sort of longer question about, yeah, how much effort do you need to put in before a random lottery is just as good? So we got about 80 questions, and then a big voting part of it as well. So these 2 won out in all that process. So that shows to me, I think the research community is really curious about lotteries. And I think feels like there is a bit of a license to give it a try and do some pilot work and have a go yourself in this area. Of course, you should probably ask your own community just to make sure. Okay, I'm a bit biased, but let's talk about the arguments against using a modified lottery. People say that it rewards the less deserving and less enthusiastic. I think, we can see from that slide, it's very hard to work out who is deserving. Sometimes you don't know until 10, 20 years later. So that's a bit of a fool's errand. It encourages less talented people to apply, and applicants put in less effort. Well, actually, when we asked people in the New Zealand scheme, surprisingly, people put in exactly the same amount of effort, because you still have to get through that peer review, okay? And if you're thinking about it, the logical thing from a researcher, you're applying for 150,000. So the effort you put in is probably more proportional to the potential return rather than the form in some way, although I don't know that for sure. I'm not sure that it encourages less talented people to apply. I mean, we've already seen in standard schemes that, researchers can be incredibly optimistic, if I'm being kind, and will often put in stuff that isn't well suited because they feel like they might have a chance, or they will turn their grant to try and fit the schemes. So that's probably happening already. Not to say that it won't happen more often. Okay, I've got a much longer list of potential benefits. I think it reduces cronyism and the perception of cronyism. So I've used it here. I'm involved in 2 small scientific societies here, and we have small travel grants, and we used it here. And, you know, one of my students wasn't going to apply because I was president at the time. And then they did, because I said, this is the system. I have no control over it. People aren't going to say you only got it because of me. I think that's great. And then, you know, I ended up that obviously people who I knew in this small community were winners, but I felt completely fine with that because it was all above board. I think it does increase diversity in applicants and winners. And sorry, Ken, I didn't actually, we're still writing up the results, but a very interesting result that happened with the British Academy scheme that Ken just described is that we have seen a significant increase in applicants from an Asian background, and a small but still there increase in applicants from a Black background. And I think that is really interesting. So the other thing I should say is all applications went up, as Ken showed there. So everybody was attracted by the scheme. But the fact that people from a non-white background applied more, I think it's likely that some of them perceived a bias in the system before, and that having a lottery there must have made them feel that they had more of a chance. And we know there's going to be less unconscious bias. We know that if you try and pick apart people on tiny divisions to rank people in these scores, when you're getting down to that funding line, there really is very marginal decisions that you can make, and that's where this unconscious bias can creep in. It reduces application and review costs, I think, although as we saw in New Zealand, actually applicants spent the same amount of time, but generally it's easier to judge whether people are above or not, rather than whether they're a score of 2 or 3 or 3.5 or whatever scheme you have. I think it acknowledges that science is unpredictable. And I think that's a good thing. Like, we know, and not just science, sorry, I should say that in the humanities as well, it's wonderfully unpredictable. Let's embrace that. Let's try and stop pretending that we can pick the winners. It definitely reduces the stigma of failure. So that's some feedback we've had from people who didn't win, that they didn't feel as bad. Being rejected by, being judged as meritorious, but, you got knocked out by a sort of robot, essentially, rather than a person, definitely makes people feel better. And we know that there is, I know in Australia I've seen it because it's a small community, there is the potential for sort of hatred and these, weird feelings of sort of people putting you down can spread. It might reduce the Matthew effect. So, that's where sort of the rich get richer. Be interesting to see whether, we haven't checked yet, whether people actually put on their CV, oh, I won this at random. Probably not. Applicants might try more innovative ideas. I think that has got to be one of the most potential interesting benefits. So we know that in funding, there's a perception that, it only moves forward in little gaps. So I'm going to put in an application that's maybe not that adventurous because I don't want to scare the reviewers. I want to make sure this is feasible. Whereas if you're only trying to get above a certain threshold, it might make you put in those more innovative ideas and might make science move faster. So that's a very big, bold claim, which we don't know yet, but definitely worth looking at. And the last thing it does, it creates an ideal randomised trial of funding. We've never had a randomised trial of funding. The New Zealand Health Research Council was the first one. And if you think about how we embrace randomised trials in science, to not have a randomised trial of funding, which has handed out trillions of dollars, seems pretty incredible. I'm going to go back to the Swedish example, because in Sweden they randomised people to go to medical school or not. We have a randomised trial of the effect of having a doctor in your family, which is a pretty incredible randomised trial to have. And the results as well are pretty incredible. So we can see here, what we've got down the x-axis here is your income rank. So we can see, and this is basically a sort of mortality proportion up here. So we can see that people in higher income die less. Yep, we already knew that. But in each income rank, those people who had a health professional in the family had a big jump in, the triangles are the people with a health professional in the family, a big decrease in mortality, which is just an amazing result. So clearly having a doctor in the family, having someone to ask about, should I take the vaccine? I've got this strange spot on my skin. Should I go and see somebody? Maybe even simple things like that. Interestingly, it does also narrow as you get richer, I think, as well. So bigger benefit for those people in a lower SES. But what an amazing thing to know, and could inform policy. Look, there is a potential for bad publicity. They've started using lotteries in Ireland for oversubscribed degree courses. And this was an article from last year. So, a girl who's worked very hard, got straight A's, and missed out. And I think that is bad. I'm hoping that she will get other opportunities, and this will be just a minor blip for her. But of course, there's always people who miss out. Maybe some of those people who miss out, don't go to the press or aren't well connected. And it does sting for those people who have lost and done nothing wrong. I think I'm only just 2 slides away. One little interesting thing I've thought about recently is some people don't believe there's actually a lottery. So I'm wondering whether we should actually give people a ticket when they apply. And that could be something, all sorts of different scientists' name. You get allocated a scientist at random. You're Isaac Newton, you're Marie Curie. And then when I draw the numbers, it'll actually be a sort of a list, and you have to check whether your name's on there. But I think it might help people if they see that they actually physically get a ticket. It might make it a bit more transparent. I mean, if you think about the Claretta Con, I can't know how to pronounce it, that was done openly in the public for a reason, to show that that it was fair and it was above board. So I'm not sure about that. We could do it based on when people press the button, we could do it on the millisecond that they applied, which would also be a random number, but they have some control over it, if you like. Okay. Complex application systems may feel thorough, may feel like you're doing a good job, but they do have costs, and they are potentially amplifying biases. There's never, ever, 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 ever going to be a perfect system for the incredibly difficult task of allocating research funding. Never, ever, ever. So we're choosing the least worst system if we can. And I think lotteries can be that least worst system. They can be actually the most scientific approach when the reasons run out. Let's choose people at random. Thanks.